Hi there and welcome. Thanks for joining us. Today we're talking about Lua Data Types. Hi there, so welcome back. So today, Lua Data Types. Whenever working with a new programming language, it's always important to identify what data types you can use within your scripts. Lua is no different. So with Lua being a dynamically typed language, you never really know what the types are until you actually run the script. Those types are then passed through from one variable to the other variable using assignments. Those data types come in several different flavors, however. Firstly, nil. Nil is a data type within itself, but actually doesn't contain any data. I'm going to do a new video in time to come about nil because it's quite a special type. But in essence, you have a variable, but it has no value. You can assign nil and you can also check for nil as well. But in essence, you can't use it to be able to query any further values from nil itself. It's a special type. Secondly, there's number. Now, if you're using Lua 5.1 or 5.2, number is just number and is always represented as a floating point. This means that it has a decimal place. Now, most of the time you don't really need to worry about this, but you do need to be concerned about floating point rounding issues. And again, I'll probably do another video upon that subject itself. However, in Lua 5.3 and now the new Lua 5.4, you've actually got the differentiation between an integer and a float. That is a number with either a decimal place or not a decimal place, a round full integer number. So you can, in actual fact, I'll come on later as to how you can identify the difference between a float and an integer. For the moment though, let's look at the next data type. Next data type is string. So string is just simply text that we can store within a set of quotes. On that point, those set of quotes can be double quotes or single quotes, as long as you use them at the beginning and the end and they're consistent. Interestingly enough as well, and again I'll do another video upon this at a later time, but you can also have multi-line string. It's similar to, if you are familiar with C++, it's familiar with the, it's similar rather to the modern C++ raw strings, where you can contain new lines, raw new lines within the string and go upon multi-lines to define your string. Really useful for representing data types like JSON, for instance, which is really good representation of that data. Moving on, we've got Boolean. So every single language, with the exception of C, of course, had Boolean. So Boolean is a flag for just yes, no, or on, off. Comprises of just those two simple values and can represent whether something is true or not. Next up, there's function. So function is in Lua, function is a first-class citizen, so you can actually treat this as a value in itself. You can pass functions around, as in function references. You can instantiate a new function and then pass this back as a new callback. It's quite commonplace in scripting languages, especially, for instance, JavaScript and TypeScript, to be able to hand it across those types of functions as a new value and as a data type in itself. Next up, there's the Lua showcase, which is, of course, the table. So table is a data type of which can contain several different values in a structure format. I won't go into detail about table because, sure enough, as you probably guessed, there'll be another video on that too. Now, they're pretty much all of the fundamental data types within Lua, and they're mainly the data types that you'll be coming across quite often when you're developing your Lua scripts. But there are two more data types that are recognised within Lua that you may come across, maybe not so often, but we'll touch on them very, very briefly. So the first one is user data. So user data is really where you're being able to bind in memory from another language, primarily C or C++, because that's where you can embed Lua and have it to be its strongest really. So user data is where we're handing off a particular object in one of our native languages. You might be passing it through Sol 2 or Sol 2 version 3, whatever you're up to right now, and you're accessing that data within Lua. So of course then it doesn't really have a Lua data type in itself because we've defined it in another language, so therefore that's classed as user data. The next one is thread. Now this is a little bit of a confusing name in my opinion, because really Lua doesn't contain threads. Lua doesn't provide the ability to have a multi-threaded paradigm. What it does have, however, is coroutines. Coroutines are slightly different from threads. So if you come from a C++ or a C# or any other language that really does contain a multi-threaded approach to your language, then coroutines are a little bit different, and they're really just a way of being able to hand off another thread of execution under one thread really. So you're able to yield a coroutine and say, right, I'm finished doing the work that I'm doing right now, and I'm going to allow that to run. And whilst that's running, the coroutine that you were on beforehand is currently paused. It's almost a little bit similar to JavaScript, and especially Node in that instance if you're front end, if you're Node experienced. So that's really the belt and braces for all of the Lua native data types. Of course, the next question is, once I've got my data stored somewhere, I've got some variable, and I want to identify really what's in it. So without going too much into the LuaScript's type deduction system, of which we really want to be able to share with yourselves, it was probably worth noting what you do in vanilla Lua. So Lua, you'd be able to define your variable and you'd assign a value to it. Then you can use the type function. So you would take the type function and you pass the variable within it. That would then pass back or return a string that represents the type of that variable. So that's extremely useful. Now, like I'd said earlier, to do with Lua 5.3 and 5.4 with their number type, they've also split that out to be integer and float. The math library has its own type function. So if you type in math.type, and in the same way with type, hand in that variable, that would also define whether it is a number or a float, which is really, really useful to be able to work with, especially when concerning yourself with floating point rounding error. Like I said, new video coming on that soon. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. As always, if you're into the financial market trading at all and you want to turn your Lua skills into an algorithm, then please feel free, go to script.trading for more information. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.